welcome to this week's episode of Red Fox Roundup, where we come full circle on the sports news of the week. Alongside Frank Sala and Ben Hayes, I'm your host, Nicole Romeos. In this week's episode, we will be talking about the top teams in the NCAA, what is to be expected this season in the NBA, and the latest news in the NFL. We'll start with the NCAA football. Well, the updated rankings came out yesterday. What are your thoughts?
Well, for me, a little bit of surprise, a little bit of a change. Clemson stayed number 1. Alabama moved up to where LSU was at number 2. Ohio State remained at 3, and then Notre Dame jumped into that 4 spot. So a little bit of a change we saw. But going into now my top 4, I'm going to keep it the same with Clemson number 1. My opinion, best win on the season in beating Notre Dame at home by 2 points. They also beat Florida State, and now they're in the driver's seat to win the ACC and really, go on to get that number 1 seed in the college football playoff.
I also have Clemson as my number 1 team, and that's mainly because they're just able to grind out every win. They played Florida State this past weekend. It was a big matchup against the number 16 team in the country and one of the other best teams in the ACC. But, with only 6 points at halftime, it looked like they might lose this game. But, they were just able to grind out the win. Their defense played strong. They stayed together and played as a unit. And they were able to win by about 15 points, just really showing why they're the top dog this season. That's why they're still my number 1 and the country's number 1.
All right, moving along, number 2 for me, I'm going to go with the Alabama Crimson Tide. Big win this weekend over LSU, stopping Leonard Fournette, who had been the country's best rusher, the leader in the Heisman poll so far. He was averaging 197 yards. They held him to just 31 in a truly dominating win at home for Alabama. They have a bad loss in Ole Miss at home, but, Ole Miss beat them last year, so not that much different. And Alabama, they do have 3 top 10 wins on the year, so definitely something that the committee will look for and improve their resume.
And this is where we differ here a little bit, Frank. I actually have Ohio State as my number 2. They're the number 3 in the nation's polls, and obviously J.T. Barrett, will no longer be remaining on the Buckeyes roster for the rest of the season. But obviously they're the defending champions, and Cardale Jones is the reason for that, and he's still the starter right now. I like how they're an undefeated team. Obviously, though, they have a lot of good matchups coming up. They play Michigan State on the 21st, and following that is Michigan. So those are 2 very good teams that they can play and potentially give them a loss. But as of right now, I like Ohio State as my number 2 pick.
At number 3, I have Notre Dame Fighting Irish. I believe they play the toughest schedule in college football. Their only loss was to the number 1 team in the country, Clemson, and that was on the road. And it was the first week that Deshaun Kaiser was their starting quarterback after Malik Zaire went down against Georgia Tech. Notre Dame, like I just said, toughest strength of schedule, still have to play Stanford on the road. You already beat teams like Navy, who's ranked, Temple, who's ranked, Georgia Tech, who was ranked, and then a tough USC team on the road. It's looking good for the Irish going forward.
Yeah, that USC game was very tough. I'm a big USC fan, actually. My number 3 team is your number 2 team, actually, Alabama. They're actually my only team in my top 4 that has lost a game so far this season. As I said, I like undefeated teams. I think teams that haven't lost deserve a chance to keep playing for the rest of the season. But, Alabama, they really held, the best player in the country by far, Leonard Fournette, to only 31 yards and 19 touches. He was able to sneak into the end zone in the end of the first half of that game, but they really just dominated the line. Brandon Harris, the starting quarterback for the Tigers, only completed 6 passes in the game. That's just ridiculous how good their defense is, and it shows that they should be a top 4 team.
Number 4, I'm going to give the Big 12 a little bit of credit here, and that's Oklahoma State. Last year, the committee gave them no love by leaving both TCU and Baylor out of last year. Oklahoma State coming off a huge win against TCU. TCU has the best quarterback in the country in Javon Boykin, who had just been dominating his opponents so far. And now, what favors Oklahoma State is they have such a back-heavy schedule where you still have to play Oklahoma and you still have to play Baylor, 2 top 10 teams, and then on the road to Iowa State. It could really help Oklahoma State's resume if they could run the table, win out in the Big 12. They should be a lock in the top 4 for the committee.
My number 4 team is another Big 12 school, and that's Baylor, actually. They're 8-0 right now. They've had some good wins, but, their 3 biggest games of the season still remain on the schedule, and that's Oklahoma this weekend, Oklahoma State the next weekend, and then traveling to Texas Christian University to play them the weekend after. Obviously they were left off the ballot last year, weren't able to make it in, and a lot of people were upset about that. But, this season, I honestly see them losing. one of those games. But right now, I think they're the fourth best team in the country. They've had the fourth best resume. I think they deserve to be in if it was to end right now.
So just outside the bubble, one of your teams, you had them at number 2, the Ohio State Buckeyes. The only reason I feel the committee has them at number 3 right now and is giving them so much respect is because they're the defending national champions. Last year they had a bad loss against Virginia Tech at home, ended up winning it all with their third-string quarterback. This year, Urban Meyer has yet to really rely on one starting quarterback. He's gone back and forth between J.T. Barrett and Cardale Jones, and now J.T. Barrett, going forward, he's going to lose some time coming off the DUI suspension last week. Cardale Jones has played well in the starters, but, the real reason that Ohio State has been keeping around is Ezekiel Elliott, who's probably the second best running back in the country behind Fournette. The way he's just dominating the line of scrimmage. And, if Ohio State can come down, run the table in the Big Ten, win the Big Ten against an undefeated Iowa, maybe they'll have a chance to get in. But right now, the way they've played, that's why they're out of my top 4.
A bubble team for me is LSU, actually. They obviously just lost that somewhat embarrassing game to Alabama. Obviously, it's hard to have an embarrassing loss to Alabama. But, with the way Fournette played, obviously the way Harris played, they didn't live up to expectations at all. But still, that's their only loss of the season to Alabama, a top 4 team in the rankings right now. So, and that being said, they can't be far off. Another team I have here is Florida, who've just been coming out great this whole season so far. So I expect both teams to do well going forward, maybe get a chance to get back into the top 4 for LSU.
Yeah, another team I'd like to keep my eye on, Stanford, the Stanford Cardinal. Their only loss in the year was on the road at Northwestern. They're looking to run the table in the Pac-12, have a favorable schedule. If they could win out, if they win out, that would mean they would beat Notre Dame at home and then win the Pac-12 championship game against probably Utah. That would give them a favorable matchup if one of their teams in the top 4 were to drop.
Well, we'll just have to see how the rest of the season plays out, huh? That wraps up our segment on NCAA football. Next up, our analysts will be previewing NBA teams. Welcome back. The NBA season is officially underway. What team should fans be on the lookout for this year?
Well, one team that I've had my eye on since the summer, since really the end of last season, I should say, is the Milwaukee Bucks. They've really been on the up since maybe halfway through last season. Jason Kidd has really got these guys playing well as a unit. They play very strong defense as a team, and they've really have a lot of good shooters on the team. Chris Middleton is actually one of my favorite players in the league right now. He's a great defensive player. He can play both the 2 and the 3. He was a free agent this offseason, and the Bucks were able to re-sign him. I want him to come to Boston, obviously, as a Boston fan. But he's really showed how good of a player he is. And with Jabari Parker finally coming back from his ACL injury, he only adds more depth to the team. He's going to continue to start. But, when he comes back into form, he'll just be a lethal weapon for the Bucks.
Yeah, the thing I like most about Milwaukee is, last year no one really expected anything from them, and they weren't bad enough to get a top 5 pick. So what they did, you go out and you get Michael Carter-Williams, you get Tyler Ennis, you get Miles Plumlee, and all of a sudden, once Jabari Parker comes back, that's getting Jabari Parker and Carter-Williams playing together. That's as good as having a top 10 draft pick. And then you add in Greg Monroe, you add the Greek Freak. This Milwaukee team could be pretty good in the Eastern Conference this year.
I agree. Obviously they haven't played the top competition yet, so I'm going to be a little hesitant on saying whether they're going to be one of the top seeds in the East. But right now, I think they're a strong pick moving forward.
Right. The team for me to look out for this year, the Boston Celtics. Last year, no one expected anything from this Brad Stevens coach team. They ended up getting the 7 seed, lost to the Cavs in the first round of the playoffs, but, that was kind of expected with LeBron's team he had last year. The thing with the Celtics, sort of did the same thing. Got rid of Rajon Rondo. You brought in a great wing defender in Jay Crowder. You got some draft picks back in that. You also went out and you traded for Isaiah Thomas. Probably going to be the 6th man of the year this year, hopefully. He's looking good so far. And another thing to add in with them is their bench. You got Isaiah Thomas, James Young, Evan Turner, David Lee, and Kelly Olynyk. That's just as good as a starting 5.
You mentioned how no one really expected Stevens to bring this team as well as they have been playing. But, I feel like he might be the most valuable player, or person, I should say, on this team. He's always been such a great coach at Butler. He's able to lead 2 really mediocre teams to the final. And he's just shown how good of a coach he is here, bringing a team with no stars, other than maybe Isaiah Thomas, into a playoff berth last season. One thing I really liked, though, is that they brought in Amir Johnson. He's a good post presence that they were really lacking last season.
Yeah, and the thing to look out for the Celtics is no matter how good they play this year or how bad, they have the Nets draft pick. So if the Nets are 0-7 right now, so if the Nets continue to fall and the Celtics continue to do good, the Celtics are still looking at maybe a top 3 pick in next year's draft.
Which is great. You mentioned Jay Crowder also. He just paid visit to his old stadium, which is the Milwaukee Bucks Stadium, actually. It's a partner stadium with Marquette,
Mm-hmm.
And he actually performed great there. But another team I feel like is on the rise right now, and I did not expect this at all, is the Detroit Pistons. Andre Drummond is just on a tear right now, averaging 19.5 points per game and 19.5 rebounds per game, which is just astronomical numbers, something I've never really seen, at least in recent memory.
Yeah, they've really looked incredible. Brandon Jennings is out for at least half the year with his Achilles injury. You just signed Reggie Jackson, in my opinion, to a ridiculous 5-year, $80 million contract, a career six-man, getting paid that much money. A lot of players around the league didn't think he deserved that much. He's playing great so far. You mentioned Drummond. You add the Marcus Morris, who's having a great year. Stanley Johnson off the bench, the rookie that they drafted in the first round. And this this Detroit Pistons team looking good so far. And if they can get Brandon Jennings back to be their sixth man, and hey, you add in Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, they can score the basketball.
Caldwell-Pope was my pick for Rookie of the Year 2 years ago, and he really did not perform well. I thought I was kind of stupid at the time, but now he's playing phenomenally. He's averaging 15 points a game. He's really come on as a good scorer.
Yeah, I like them so far.
I'm surprised neither of you brought up the Warriors yet.
Hey, 8-0, they had a lot of expectations coming in. Pretty much the same exact team from last year, minus David Lee. But, hey, Steph Curry's playing at a ridiculous level right now.
Do you think he'll continue?
I think he can definitely continue. When he has the ball, it's almost automatic that it'll end up in the net somehow. Every shot he takes is just ridiculous. He'll put guys on skates, and he'll just shoot a ridiculous shot. And if anyone else was shooting it, it would just be like, there's no way that goes in. And he just swishes it.
With that, what teams do you think are going to have a rough season?
Well, right now I'm looking at the Los Angeles Lakers, which is really too bad for me. Kobe Bryant, he's been a phenomenal player throughout his career in the NBA. Obviously, he's had some ups and downs, whether it's more off the court than on the court or, with teammates and stuff. But, right now he's averaging 16.5 points per game, which, obviously isn't awful. I mean, for him, since he's really a scorer first, it's not the greatest it could be. But the way that the Lakers seem to be kind of under the radar trying to drive him out of the NBA is really disheartening for me. Head coach Byron Scott, who, has always been a great friend to Kobe, they've known each other for years. He's now mentioned multiple times to the media how this might be Kobe's last season, as if to insinuate to Bryant that it should be. Mm-hmm. The Lakers are 1-6 right now, and their one win was to the winless Brooklyn Nets. So they've really just been playing awful. They just lost by I think it was 2 points about 5 minutes ago to the Magic. So that just makes it even worse.
Yeah, the thing with the Lakers, and you hate to say it, is as long as Kobe Bryant's playing, they're not going to get much better. Kobe's averaging, you said he's averaging the 16.5 points, but he's also averaging about 15 to 16 shots per game, which isn't very good. He doesn't care about his shooting percentage, but when you got guys you need to develop, like D'Angelo Russell, like Jordan Clarkson, like Julius Randle, you need to get them the ball more. The Lakers aren't going to be very good this year. So you need to let your young guys develop, and hey, you got to be bad enough to finish in the bottom three. Because if you don't finish in the bottom three, you're going to lose your draft pick, and then this year goes to waste.
You mentioned how they need to develop their younger players. I guess then, Kobe getting excused from practice for being too mad at himself might have actually benefited the team then, since their players can develop even more.
And hey, it's been said that Byron Scott was only brought in for this job because the Lakers organization knew he couldn't coach this team. And as of right now, it's looking like that they brought Scott in just to tank.
It's really ridiculous if you ask me.
Yeah. But hey, the team I don't like, we've mentioned them already, the Brooklyn Nets. No draft picks coming up in this year's draft, or at least in the first round. And that's for the next couple of years. They gave them all to Boston when they got KG, Ray Allen, and Paul Pierce. Not looking good there. And then, they have a mediocre lineup at best. Struggling, aging stars, Joe Johnson, Brook Lopez. The best thing that can happen for the Nets, you trade both those guys and hope to get picks back.
When they made that trade with Boston, people kind of saw in the future that maybe this could happen. They traded for two guys that were really going to be mediocre in the regular season. They might catch a spark in the postseason as they had the past couple years, with the Boston Celtics, but they really didn't get too much talent in that trade, especially to give away all those draft picks. So, now it's really come to bite them where it hurts.
Yeah, you have some good young guys in Markel Brown, Rondé Hollis-Jefferson, but these aren't guys you can build around. These are just going to be role players for the majority of their career. So, they're going to have to go out and do something to really, be competitive, they're going to get competitive in the next couple of years.
I agree.
All right, well, it's still the beginning of the season, so we'll just have to see. That wraps up our NBA previews. Next, we will be giving mid-season NFL reactions. Welcome back. This past weekend, the Steelers defeated the Raiders in an overtime thriller. What happened here? Are the Raiders for real this season?
To say they're for real, so far, yes. They're 4-4. They beat the teams they needed to beat. They played some great games. But, if going to this game, the Raiders made some mistakes. It was a fun game to watch, mostly for fantasy implications. You had D'Angelo Williams go for 170 yards. You had Antonio Brown go 17 catches, 284 yards. And then on the other side, Derek Carr is emerging into one of the great quarterbacks in the NFL right now. 301 yards and 4 touchdowns. He's hitting his receivers. Michael Crabtree's looking great. And Amari Cooper's looking like the offensive rookie of the year so far. 7 catches, 88 yards. But in this game, the Raiders really shot themselves in the foot. 5 turnovers, 2 fumbles by Latavius Murray down the stretch, 1 on a punt return. You can't be having that if you want to make the playoffs if you're the Raiders.
You mentioned how Cooper looks like the offensive rookie of the year. He's playing so well that a lot of times I forget that he's a rookie. He went to Alabama last year, obviously. He was a top draft pick, but he's come on as one of the best receivers, at least young receivers in the game, kind of rivaling Odell Beckham a little bit right there. But I think the Raiders' most telling win this season was last week, or I should say 2 weeks ago now, against the New York Jets. Obviously the Jets are one of the better teams in the league this season, which hasn't been the case, in the past few seasons. But that just wasn't really a close game, and the Raiders were able to step up on defense. Khalil Mack, one of the best young players in the game right now on either side of the ball.
Right.
Played a fantastic game. Charles Woodson, he's one of the oldest players in the game, and he's still got it. He's still one of the best there. So they have the old and the young, really making a good unit on defense there. And they just come along, and obviously you mentioned the AC/DC combo, Amari Cooper, Derek Carr. I think they are legit. I really do.
So you think they'll be able to make the playoffs this season?
I think they can. That might be more because of how lacking the AFC is of good teams this season. But right now, I think they would be the 6th seed if the playoffs were to start right now, which is a playoff team. So.
With the loss of Big Ben again, how do you think it's going to affect the Steelers as a team?
Right now, Big Ben, he says he wants to play this week, but, if you know Mike Tomlin, if you know the Steelers, that's not going to happen. Against I believe they play Cleveland this week, at home. So you don't need Big Ben if you're the Steelers this week. But, going forward, without Big Ben, if you want to win games, you got to find Antonio Brown. And that's what Michael Vick and Landry Jones have struggled to do so far. You have your weapons clicking. We saw it last game with Antonio Brown and D'Angelo Williams. If they can continue to do that and then get to the bye with a win this week, I think they're in good shape, even without Big Ben.
You mentioned how D'Angelo Williams earlier, you mentioned how he went off. The thing is, they're really going to need to rely on him to do that again if they want to beat a Cleveland team that has one of the worst rush defenses in the league, mind you, so it might be easier this week than any other week. But, he rushed for 170 yards and 2 touchdowns, easily his best week of the season so far. They brought him in because they were worried Le'Veon Bell might get hurt again, because he really killed them in the playoffs last season by getting injured. So, that was really a safety net. But when Big Ben is out of the game, Antonio Brown has only gotten 42 yards in 1 week, 45 yards in another week, 24 yards in a third week. And obviously he's their most dynamic player, especially with Le'Veon Bell out. Landry Jones just can't seem to find him. That makes Big Ben's injury that much more meaningful, that their best player can't be found on the field.
Yeah, Landry Jones is going to have to start finding guys like Marcus Wheaton or Martavius Bryant if he's going to want to win games for them.
Yeah.
Going into this weekend, the Denver Broncos were 7-0, but fell short to the Indianapolis Colts. Did you expect this result?
Well, I didn't exactly expect the Colts to win, but I don't know how the Broncos were undefeated before this. Obviously they kind of crushed, not really score-wise, but they really crushed the Packers the week before, another undefeated team at the time. But the Broncos might have been the worst undefeated team, at least 7-0 team I've ever seen. They have the best defense in the league, arguably. But their quarterback, he's thrown 9 touchdowns and 13 interceptions so far this season. He's really just awful. Obviously he's Peyton Manning. He's arguably the second best quarterback to ever live. But the way that Peyton played last game, it was really just telling of how the whole season has been so far. They're able to win on their defense and not their offense, which wasn't the same last season or the year before. So, the way that it played out, I guess, was also very telling. The Colts, they've been struggling. They're something like 3-5. But no, I didn't expect it, to answer your question.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to agree with you. I do think they were the worst undefeated team up until they beat Green Bay last week. I really thought they had figured it out. And then going to Indianapolis, where the Colts' only wins were against the Titans, the Jaguars, and the Texans. They're 3 division opponents. And, Andrew Luck only played in one of those games. So you didn't know how Luck was going to fare against that Denver Broncos defense, who coming into this week, they were scoring 56% of the Broncos' points this year. And, going with that, Peyton Manning had only scored on 12% of his drives this year, which is so unheralded for a Peyton Manning run team, especially when you have weapons like C.J. Anderson, Demaryius Thomas, Emmanuel Sanders, guys like that.
Ryan Clady, he had a season-ending injury in the beginning of the season, or it was more the preseason. That's really been the most underrated story for this Broncos team so far this year. That made the offensive line, so much worse. Now Peyton has less time to throw the ball, which, he already has a weaker arm, mainly because of his neck surgery in old age. But, that's really made it harder for him to find his receivers. But on top of that, since the offense hasn't been progressing very much on the passing game, the run game has been affected too. Last season, C.J. Anderson caught fire, mainly because everyone was so worried that Peyton was going to beat them with his arm. Now that Peyton isn't beating him with his arm and the offensive line can't really protect them anymore, the run game has diminished as well. So, it's really all comes back to Ryan Clady getting injured that has just killed this offense.
Yeah, and the run game was what's really hurt them in this one. Peyton had some great numbers. He out-threw Luck in the air, threw as many touchdowns as he did. But the Colts ground game outran them 120-35, led by Frank Gore with 83 yards and a touchdown. C.J. Anderson only 34 yards on the ground. So, going forward, Denver's really going to have to figure out that complement to Peyton Manning's throwing. They're going to need, whether it's Ronnie Hillman or C.J. Anderson, or you go out and sign someone, they're going to need someone to run the ball and help them down the stretch.
So by saying this, do you think Luck had the better game over Peyton?
Well, he got the win. And, obviously some people say wins aren't a quarterback stat, but essentially, they're the leader of the team. I think it is a quarterback stat. So, yeah, I do think Luck had the better game. Obviously now he's out 2 to 6 weeks, which is kind of killing for the Colts. But, I mean, they're only, one game up right now in the Texans, so obviously nothing's set in stone. But I think they're kind of a lock for the number 4 seed. I think the regular season from here on out is just kind of a measure as to whether, it gets easier, and just test them for the playoffs, make sure they're ready by the time that comes. The offensive coordinator for the Colts has been calling a lot of 7-step drops for Andrew Luck, and the Colts have arguably the worst offensive line in the league. Those 7-step drops have been killing Luck. He goes all the way back, and then the defenders are already there before he can release the ball. However, when Hasselbeck is in the game, which he will be for at least the next 2 weeks, they call 3-step drops, and they throw shorter passes, they complete the passes, and they're able to gain yards. I don't know why they haven't been doing that for Luck.
Right, and to answer your question, I don't think Luck had the better game. I just think, Manning's numbers speak for themselves. They're clearly better than Luck's, but the only thing Luck did differently is Luck didn't turn the ball over. And that was only the second time this year he had not thrown an interception. Coming in, these two guys were 1 and 2 in interceptions thrown. I think Luck was 1, Peyton was 2, now it's Peyton 1. So just because Luck didn't throw a pick, maybe give him the slight edge.
All right. So what a game in Minnesota. With the loss of their quarterback due to an injury, they ended up pulling through for the victory, and they're now 6-2. What are your thoughts? Are you impressed, not impressed?
Well, I was kind of expecting somewhat of this result from this game. 2 good defenses, 2 younger offenses. It was a pretty gritty game. I think the final score was something like 18-15. Something around those numbers.
Yeah, it was a 3-point game.
A lot of field goals in this game. Obviously, there was the matchup between Adrian Peterson and Todd Gurley, who've drawn a lot of comparisons to one another. But, I think the big story in this game was definitely Teddy Bridgewater getting hit in the head on a slide. When a
That was a
quarterback
scary hit.
slides, they're giving up their body, they're down as soon as they start to slide, and the hit from, it was LaMarcus Joyner, I believe, the cornerback for the Rams, came in and hit him on the head when he was almost down, giving him a concussion. He knocked him out for about 10 seconds, too. If this was Tom Brady, if this was Peyton Manning, if this was Aaron Rodgers, this would be huge news. And the fact that, there has been no penalty on Joyner, I'm not necessarily saying like a flag in the play, but, no like slap on the wrist or anything like that is kind of telling as to how much the NFL really respects the Vikings. Obviously they're 6-2. They're playing the Packers in a couple weeks. That'll really be the most telling game of the season. Right now they're tied for first, but I really think, they need to look more at that injury and that play.
Yeah, it's a scary injury. Anytime a quarterback or anyone goes down with a head injury, you hate to see that. But, the Vikings, you're going to have to rely on Sean Hill now. Teddy Bridgewater had really had this offense clicking. After week 1, when you lost 20-3 at San Francisco, a surprising result to many, they've gone on and won 6 of 7. Their only loss, a 6-point loss at Denver. So, the Vikings have looked good. And, you mentioned their leader, Adrian Peterson. He's leading the league in rushing right now with 758 yards and 4 touchdowns. And, getting him back, he's really got this offense clicking.
He really has, I agree. Yeah.
So why do you think they're 6-2? Have they played any good enough teams yet, or?
Well, mainly they're 6-2 because their offense is good and their defense is good. But schedule-wise, the combined opponents that they have beaten are 13-27. So anytime the teams you faced are that bad, it definitely plays in your favor schedule-wise.
I think an interesting story going forward is going to be the progression of Stephon Diggs. He's come on, I think, the last 3 or 4 weeks. He's been really pivotal to that offense now that there's a new quarterback throwing the ball. We'll see how well he does. He's really been one of the only receivers in Vikings, recent history that has been able to run the routes well, during the entire game. They've had fast guys like Cordero Patterson who've just kind of been a flash in the pan. But, Stephon Diggs seems like he should be the real deal for the Vikings. They just need to give him the ball just like, the Steelers need to give Antonio Brown the ball.
Yeah, coming up, they still have to play Oakland. They go to Oakland, and we mentioned Oakland. They've been a tough team so far. You have Green Bay twice, Atlanta, Seattle, at Baltimore, who's played in a close game just about every week, even though their record says otherwise. And then you got the Bears, divisional opponent, and the Giants. So if the Vikings are going to make the playoffs, it's going to be because they're a legitimate team.
And I think they can make the playoffs.
We'll see. That wraps up this week's episode of the Red Fox Roundup. He's Frank Sala, that's Ben Hayes, and I'm Nicole Romeos. And we're off.